Good evening. Tonight we're looking to finish our studies in Daniel. It is not my intention to go into great detail in Daniel chapter 11. To sum it up, it's wars, it's battles. If you want to put it that way, we're going to look at it a little more closely than that. But that's really what it's talking about there. We know, though, however, there are those who, when they look at Daniel chapter 11, and they see the armies from the north, or the king from the north and the king from the south, they try to apply it to people like Russia and others. In fact, I have a couple books in my office that were given to me. They're written by a denominational preacher, and he tried to apply that to them, to Russia and to some others. I can't remember what all he tried to apply them to. But we look in the Bible, we look at some real history, we'll find that is not the case that we're going to be finding in Daniel chapter 11. But we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11 just briefly, or briefly as possible. We're going to try to spend the bulk of our time focusing on chapter 12, looking specifically at a couple of verses there in chapter 12, and then bring our lesson to a close this evening. But in Daniel chapter 11, we find wars between the kings of Egypt and the kings of Syria, and they're depicted throughout chapter 11. And really in verses 1 through 4 of Daniel chapter 11, you have the Persian and Greece conflict. Like I said, we're not going to go into great detail about it. We find here these, from this point on, really we begin to see some of the details of what's going to happen, beginning with Cyrus and going forward into the Roman Empire. The three kings being Cyrus, Kempis, Darius, and the fourth being Xerxes. That's going to be mentioned in chapter 11, going to be describing at least their actions, I should say. They're not going to be mentioned specifically, but that's whose actions are being referenced. Some believe this to be the Xerxes. It's also found in Esther chapter 1 and verse 1. But we find this conflict between Persia and Greece here in verses 1 through 4, and then we find a conflict between Egypt, the south, and Syria, the north, in verses 5 through 20. You have the king of the south of Egypt there in verse 5, and the various, really some say for 11 years that he engaged, that Antiochus the second engaged in war with him, after which he gave his daughter to Bernice, to Bernice Antiochus. The arrangement terminated the wars. He later was poisoned by I'm going to mispronounce his name, Leotis, his wife, by Leotis, and his wife he left for Ptolemy's daughter. And so a lot of just things going on there among that family. We find in verse 6, and they brought her, we find this mentioned in verse 6, means many of Bernice's women attendants were killed there in verse 6. You find that phrase that's being mentioned there. It says, at the end of some of years, they shall join forces with the daughter of the king of the south, shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up, and with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. In verses 7 through 8, you find the south will rise in wrath. And so what we find here are just numerous battles between these nations and their leaders, really going back and forth, until you ultimately get to the rise of the Roman Empire, as we know would lead up to, which really would bring us up to, no doubt was eventually to them destroying Jerusalem. That's what I'm trying to say here. So you have a conflict between Egypt in the south and Syria in verses 5 through 20. We find in verse 5 the king of the south here is mentioned. And let's keep going. Verse 7 and 8, the south will rise in wrath. Verses 9 and 10, this was a war between Egypt and the territory of this king, whose name I'm sure again I probably won't be able to pronounce. The king of the south will respond in rage. Verses 11 through 13, like I said, just wars and wars and wars and wars and wars and battles between these kings back and forth in chapter 11. Others will contribute to the war against the south, which we find in verse 14 of chapter 11. The king of the north shall prevail against the south, but then fall. We find in verses 15 through 20. Like I said, keep in mind, it's not my intention to go into great detail about it. If you want to know more about it, I'd be glad to give you some information I have on it. But our main focus is going to be on chapter 12 here in just a moment. In verses 21 through 45, you have the rise and fall of a vile king that's mentioned here, the vile king from the north in verses 21 through 45. He will provoke the king of the south, as we also find in verses 25 through 28. And really in this large chunk you find in verses 36 through 45, the Romans coming into view in verses 36 through 45 of Daniel chapter 11. We find, again, those who would resist, those who know God will resist him steadfastly. That is, those who are resisting must see the persecution of the Romans and also others as well. As we find a reference in there in verses 30 through 32 of Daniel chapter 11, how this king will take out his rage against the holy covenant, or against, you might say, against just those who are followers of God in general. We find in verses 36 through 45 also the blasphemy of the king. He will magnify himself above every god. If you look at verses 36 and 37, you know, this is a common trait among evil kings, at least those who are evil until they repent, is that they look at themselves as God, or they ultimately elevate themselves as God. We know Nebuchadnezzar was bold enough to create that golden image, and we know that he eventually would come around. But we find here this king would magnify himself above every god, and he shall honor a god of fortresses in verses 38 and 39. The conquest in the end, we find in verse 40, the king of the south, that is Egypt, shall attack him. The king of the north will respond and overwhelm the countries. We find mentioned there in verses 40 through 43. And he shall come to end in verses 44 and 45. Again, that is an extremely rushed version of it, but that was not my intention to spend all our time in Daniel chapter 11. Because where I want to spend our time is in Daniel chapter 12. Because I think this really, to me, really applies to us more today. Now, I know, as I said before, there are those who will look at Daniel 11 and try to apply it to countries of today. And the reason they do that is for this, is because they want to look at these things and say, well, here's this battle, see, it's pointing to the end of times. I want you to remember this very clear to me, a very simple point. And I used to say this all the time when I taught synoptics for OABS, that when you get to things like Matthew 24 and you look at things like Daniel, you have to think about it this way. If there are signs pointing to a event, they cannot point to the judgment day. And the reason I say that is Christ himself tells us that no one knows, not him nor the angels of heaven, but his Father only. So when people start talking about all these signs, you have to remind them there are no signs of the end of time. And keep in mind, Judgment Day is the end of time, because when Christ returns, Peter tells us the heaven will be destroyed and all the elements thereof, right? But whenever we read about those and hear those people talking about, well, we see this sign and this sign, it can't be pointing towards the end of time. Daniel, as we see here, with all these events taking place, even though he himself admits freely, as we see later in chapter 12, he doesn't understand everything. But us today, being able to look back at Daniel's time and look at and listen to the words of Christ, we understand more, not to say more about it than Daniel did, but we understand certain aspects about it that Daniel did not understand, specifically the destruction of Jerusalem as well. So let's look at Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, the verses tonight will not be on the screen, so you'll have to just follow along with me here. In Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, you find really the ultimate victory of Daniel's people. We notice in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, the Bible says, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands, to watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. Now this is a continuation right after verse 45. He continues on talking about these things. This, at that time, well, keep in mind this, the key to understanding this chapter is the expression, at that time. It is clear that this is a continuation of the events of chapter 11, which ended with the end of the rule of Antiochus. At that time means that this king's time would come to an end. Notice with me verse 2. It says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, it's important to understand this verse must not be taken out of context. Whatever we think about this at that time refers to must be that which is mentioned back in verse 1. He says here in verse 2, verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now again, this has to be referring back to what he's mentioned there in verse 1. This cannot be, at least to me, doesn't seem really to be talking about what we consider to be the resurrection day there in verse 2. In verse 3, he says here, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn away to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. The ones who become Christians and teach others today, we are to turn to righteousness. No greater and no brighter work could ever be done. And one of the reasons is the eternal results and consequences. So again, notice here in verse 3, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament. That is who? The faithful of God. And those who turn many to righteousness, notice that phrase, and those who turn many to righteousness, what's he doing? He's talking about evangelism, isn't he? Now keep in mind all those things that Daniel talked about in chapter 11, all those wars and all those battles, and all the things that he's trying to understand about those things, all the things that Daniel has endured, all the visions he sees. And we find here in verse 3 here, what is it talking about? It talks about turning people to God. Which to me makes me think that during time of uncertainty, we too must realize that evangelism is still important. Notice there in verse 3, and those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. In verses 4 through 13, you find final instructions and answers are given to Daniel. Looking at verse 4, the Bible says, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. The vision is complete. The book is reserved throughout the fulfilling of these prophecies. Knowledge is increased when these prophecies are fulfilled and people understand the prophecies. For example, when the veil is removed. Looking at verse 5 here, then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this river bank and the other on that river bank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these things be? That's verses 5 and 6. So one of these men asked the other, who delivered the vision? He asked the question here. Now notice the answer in verse 7. Now I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. All these things shall be finished. There in verse 7. So the answer is stated as an indefinite future time from the standpoint of Daniel, as we would say today, is found in the destruction of Jerusalem. All things shall be finished when the power of the Jewish people shall be broken. The Romans will be the instrument that accomplishes this. We also know that at the destruction of Jerusalem is when many believe is when the Jewish economy would come to an end. The things will be finished within a time, times, and half a time, which means an indefinite period of time. We know now what time this was. This reference includes the end of the Jewish economy, of the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice here with me now in verse 8. He says here, although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? So even Daniel didn't understand how long this times and a half was. So even though Daniel was there and hearing these things, he did not fully understand them. We find in verse 9, and he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the time of the end. So here we are now. The words are closed up and sealed. This was a signal to Daniel, you might say, not to ask any more questions about it there in verse 9. In verse 10, many shall be purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So the righteous are purified, they are white and refined, and they are the ones who understand. The wicked, those who practice wickedness, will have no understanding about it. Look at verse 11 with me now. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, there in verse 11. This means that the sacrifices will come to an end, and the 1,290 days many believe to be just an indefinite period of time. Looking now at verse 12, blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days. But you go your way till the end, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. So we find in verse 12, for those who wait patiently, there is great blessing. And in verse 13, even though Daniel does not understand, he is to continue to be faithful and to fulfill his work as a prophet of God. And we too, even though we do not understand the mind of God or everything about such things as this, we must be faithful to the end and therefore allow God to fulfill his work through us. Now, we think about Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12, and we know, again, there's a lot of prophecies there that's being discussed, a lot of figurative language that is used, a lot of battles taking place in chapter 11. So we have to really, in my mind, move to the lessons for us today, which will help us understand why or what we can learn from Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12. And one of the things I think about is that wars are a part of the history of man. Throughout time, you might say almost seems like from the very beginning, there are wars. There's numerous nations at wars throughout history. We go back and look at the Old Testament books of history. We find wars and battles being waged. We find all types of wars going on, all the way up until, of course, we know even still today, there are various conflicts going on. So many, we know, as I mentioned before, will try to apply such things to signs of the end. However, we will do well to remember the words of Christ about such things. Again, we look at chapter 11. It can be difficult to understand, especially when we don't look at the history of those countries during that time period. But if you look at Matthew chapter 24, remember the words of Christ. Matthew 24 and verse 36. He tells us, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. What does that tell us? There are no signs about the end of time. There is no signs about telling us that Christ's judgment is coming soon, which tells us that we must be prepared always. So again, whenever we hear people start talking about signs of things, we need to remind them about the words of Christ when he tells us specifically regarding the end of time or the judgment day that there are no signs. There is no way of knowing when that day is going to be. Again, he says in verse 36, of that day and hour no one knows. Again, we know Daniel is filled with figurative language. We know books like Revelation is filled with figurative language. We know Joel is filled with all types of visions and figurative language. But again, that doesn't change what Christ says in Matthew chapter 24. Another lesson for us to think about is that Daniel remained faithful in the midst of uncertainty. He didn't understand everything that was being talked about there. We know in verse 8 of chapter 12, he says, although I heard, I did not understand. What has Daniel already proven throughout all those chapters of Daniel? That his faith is in God. Remember, this is the same man who was in the lion's den, presumably going to be put to death, and the God who is now obeying, by listening to these visions, is that same God who saved him in the den of lions is now speaking to him through these men, through these messengers. He says here in verse 8 of chapter 12, although I heard, I did not understand. I think we could say, and although he didn't understand, he didn't walk away. He still remained faithful to God. Daniel was told, as we find a few verses later, in verse 13, that he was to remain faithful, and it certainly seems that he did, as we look at verse 13. But you go your way till the end, for you shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of days. He says what? Go, remain faithful, and at the time of what? Judgment, when you die and you finally get to go to heaven, what does he say? And will arise to your inheritance. Now that is, and he's talking to Daniel specifically, when you arise, or you will arise, he says, to your inheritance at the end of the days. Not at the end of days as if the end of time, but not. For him, what would happen? He would arise to go to heaven when Christ came back at the judgment day, right? And so he has to be faithful until the end. That's what I'm trying to make there in verse 13. Now the book of Daniel gives us encouragement from start to finish. When you look at Daniel chapter 1 all the way through, even as we get to, as I said before, Daniel really is, if you look at it, it's broken up in two parts. Chapters 1 through 6, you have various events that take place. And with Daniel, his friends, and those types of things. In chapter 7, moving on, we really move into the section of visions, which Daniel is trying to understand and comprehend in his lifetime, in his period of time. But he was still faithful to God. All the things that Daniel heard, all the things he has seen with his eyes, and he still remained faithful to God, even when he didn't understand everything that was being discussed. Now think about this today. Can we honestly say that we understand every single word about the Bible? Or that we understand every single character about the Bible? I don't mean to say that we look at the Bible, we're trusting in a blind faith. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But there are some things that are what? There are some things that are very confusing, right? There are still some things, for example, for some, the book of Romans is very troubling because of some of the wording and phrases that are used. For some, the book of Revelation is very troubling because the images that are being described and the things that's being discussed, for some it's very difficult to understand. And Daniel in these visions is part of that as well. But we still must remain faithful to God, and we study to know all that we can about those things. And we would do well to notice how Daniel remained strong in times of persecution, potential death, and during times of visions that he didn't fully understand. Daniel shows that we too can remain faithful in difficult and uncertain times. Did Daniel live in uncertain times? Well, he didn't understand what was going to be coming in the future, not fully anyway, as you saw from verse 8. But even though he didn't fully understand everything that was being discussed in those visions, he never walked away from God. He knew that God was his one source of truth, his one source of comfort. He was the one who has been with him all the time that Daniel had been with God. God has been faithful to him. God never turned his back upon him, and so we can say honestly that Daniel did not turn his back upon God. We look at Daniel chapter 11 and 12, we may say, well, these are some difficult things to understand, and indeed some of them most definitely can be. But what would we find as the overwhelming picture that we come away with in Daniel is that God never leaves the faithful. We find that shown very clearly in the first 6 chapters of Daniel. With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God never left them. With Daniel, God never left him. With all these visions that are being described and Daniel being asked to be able to interpret them, God didn't leave Daniel. And in chapter 7 and beyond, when God starts revealing some visions and things through various messengers, even though Daniel does not understand all of them, does God ever say that he was disappointed in Daniel? Or that Daniel lacked understanding, or that Daniel was going to be rebuked by God? No. God never left Daniel. Which tells us today As you think about the book of Daniel, like I said, we could look a whole lot more at chapter 11 if you so desired, and look at it from a historical viewpoint. If you look at Daniel as a whole, we find that we must remain faithful to God, and that God will always be faithful to us. You think back for just a moment over the last several weeks that we have looked at the book of Daniel, and you see men, including Daniel, who faced incredible difficulties. They remained faithful in the face of, and with the face of tremendous pressure. Can you imagine being one of the three friends who stood before Nebuchadnezzar with that golden image over about 90 feet tall, if I remember correctly? This massive image was outside. They were told they had to worship, and they didn't. They're going to die. Who tells us about that? Daniel tells us about that. Who tells us about being potentially jailed and killed because he refused to pray to anyone but God. Daniel will not walk away from God for even 30 days. Remember that decree? He wasn't to petition anyone else but the king for 30 days, and Daniel did what? He petitioned God anyway. And we read about what's to come for Jerusalem and those who be living during the time of its destruction. Daniel listened to those things, even not fully understanding them. Which tells us Daniel was a man who had tremendous faith in God. I don't believe for a second you can say that Daniel had blind faith, but he definitely had a trusting one in God. This evening, as you think about these things, again, I know this is maybe not a lesson that will cause someone to put on Christ in baptism, but it is a reminder that even if we may not understand everything that's going to be happening in the future, Daniel certainly didn't. It doesn't mean we cannot remain faithful to God. Though we do not know what the future holds, we do know one thing, and Daniel knew this as well. He knew that if he wanted to have heaven as his home, he could never walk away from God. His three friends back early in the book of Daniel also knew that as well. They were tested. He was tested several times. And which tells us today that we must remember that as well. That if we want to have heaven as our home, we cannot walk away from God. We study, as the Bible tells us, to show ourselves approved of God. Workmen does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Daniel did those things. We can understand, though, during Daniel's lifetime, why he had trouble understanding those things that he did. It's easy for us, and I say it's easier for us to look back and say, well, I don't see how you can figure those things out. But we weren't living in the time period Daniel lived in. And so let's remember that, and let's remember all the things we can learn from him and his example of being faithful to God, even in times of uncertainty. This evening, as you think about these things, we can help you or encourage you in any way. You can come forward now as we stand and sing the song that's been selected.
Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood.